I'll start by saying thank you so much to the organisers for putting this together and inviting me to attend. I've never been to a meeting that was about the future of work. I realise that puts me at one far end of the distribution of people in this room. I found it really fascinating. I'm Angela McLean. I'm a biologist. I work at Oxford University. My first training was as a mathematician, so I do work with data a lot. And I chair for the Royal Society, actually I co-chair, something called the Community of Interest in Data. And that's actually, it's a party club for statisticians, some of whom call themselves machine learners, but fundamentally, they're all mathematicians or statisticians of one kind. And the idea is that we talk to each other a lot so that when Claire and her team come and say to us, oh, what should we do next? We have at least started having part of that conversation. And actually, I'm greatly enjoying that role, which I share with Zubin, whose surname I can never say. Thank you, Claire, for giving me that job. That's enough about me. Our panel this afternoon is here, and they're going to introduce themselves to you. And fundamentally, we finally get to the question of what type of future do we want to use AI to create? So please introduce yourselves as you go along, panel, because you can do it better than I can. Sandy, please start.
Okay, I'm Alex Pentland, but everybody calls me Sandy because my father had the same name, and I had to be named differently. My work is in the area of sort of big data and analytics to understand society and individuals. So I'm one of the founders of what's called computational social science, which is differentiated from regular social science in that it's sort of the art of using large-scale statistics and unusual sorts of data like telephone data to understand social dynamics. I like to call it social physics, which is a phrase that's about 2 centuries old. It was the thing that was invented in France and England at the beginning of the 1800s, and it's why we have census departments and national statistical offices. Again, same sort of vision. So I do those sorts of things. I also build real systems. So I had a group that does 85% of all of the authentication in the entire world online. And what we're doing is we're building, we write standards and model software. We don't actually do the authentication. And so now what we're doing is we're doing work on making data sharing easier, digital identity so that we can own our own identities online, privacy, and of course, how do you build systems that are compatible with society, that protect individual rights, get the sorts of expression you want, have human overview. And I've been fairly successful at that. I ran the privacy discussion at Davos with a Justice Commissioner of the EU and the head of the Federal Trade Commission in the US, and that eventually turned into GDPR. I keynoted the EU presidency opening on architectures for Europe and the rest of the world this last year, and I'll be doing the same in China, incidentally, a little bit later. The big sort of thing I'd like to bring home is that it is possible to use big data and AI techniques to understand a great deal about the quality of human society, inequality, poverty, racial divisions, ethnic warfare, without endangering privacy and without endangering any of the sort of other economic interests, and I'll tell you about that. So the core thing is we discovered many years ago when we were beginning this is that you can look at patterns of interaction between people without knowing about the people or the specifics and do a really bang-up job of estimating poverty levels, of estimating life expectancy, infant mortality, crime levels. And the bottom line is that ghettos are bad places. So if a community doesn't talk to itself, either from, which you can get from mobility, you can get it from cell phone records, you can get it from credit card records, you can get it from many sources. If a community doesn't talk to itself and it isn't embedded in the surrounding society, it's inevitably poor, has high death rates, has high crime rates. And the particular way it's not embedded or the particular lack of conversation determines a great deal about the quality of life there and what can be done. And that argues that the way we think of it, typically, traditionally, is around individuals. But what this scientific findings, which have been repeated in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and in Europe, what they indicate is that our social context is at least as important as our individual properties. Now, these are all statistical estimations. You can apply them on the individual level, but again, they're still statistical. But the really interesting thing is you can look at anonymous aggregate data, which is safe according to GDPR. It doesn't contain PII, and do a good job of estimating what's going on in a community. So we've done a number of different things. I've run a number of national level experiments where we took all the data from Cote d'Ivoire, from Senegal, from Italy, in the UK, and we packaged it up in this aggregate anonymous way and gave it out to literally hundreds of academic units who tried to break it and find something bad about it and couldn't. But they did discover that you can use the same methods to map poverty, map potential for crime, match, quantify public health, et cetera, in every corner of the world. And that's pretty interesting. And in fact, it's interesting enough that when the Sustainable Development Goals were being put together, my partners in crime and myself, notably Claire Melmood from the UK, from ODI, were able to get these methods incorporated into the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals include these big data AI analytics methods for quantifying all of the goals. There's something like 170 measurements that every country has signed up to do to be able to quantify their progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's actually really remarkable, because what you see now is you see the national statistical offices, which are the ones that are supposed to do this, struggling to sort of revamp their systems to be able to measure much more than GDP, much more than population. They're now going to be measuring access to resources. They're going to be measuring sustainability. They're going to be measuring these societal things, so that there's a great deal more accountability and transparency in countries that participate in this. And you might say, well, that's all wonderful. That's a wonderful fantasy. We all know a lot of things are aspirational, never happen. But you also see the World Bank and aid agencies conditioning aid and money on progress on the Sustainable Development Goal measurements. That means these measurements of societal properties are going to determine whether or not the money flows. The money flows if and only if you make progress on X, Y, and Z, and that's measured in this precise way, and it's uniform around the world. That's a really interesting thing. Guaranteed we don't have it quite right, but also the level of accountability and transparency that this hints at or is a step towards is really mind-boggling. We have never had anything like this before. So I'm very bullish about it. I should tell you I'm on the board of directors of the Sustainable Development Goal data aspects. So I'm hired to be a cheerleader. But the interesting thing is that there is a vision for using AI and data to really transform government, to really alleviate poverty, to really make equality a reality around the world. It's on paper. People have signed on to it. It's underway. You have to support your national statistical offices to do what they signed up to be able to do this. As part of this, I run pilot programs that are national scale pilot programs where we are building example systems of this that incorporate data from banks, telcos, government in the countries of Colombia, Senegal, and interestingly, China, funded by the government of France, government of Colombia, government of China, to be able to test out how we can have adequate human oversight about this and whether we can actually use this to build the sort of dreams that we hope from it. Because if you don't try it, you don't know if it's going to work. Guaranteed, again, it won't work the first time, but that's the point of a pilot.
Super. Sandy, thank you very much indeed. Anita, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm Anita Giovanni. I do management consulting. Admittedly, I don't do any primary research. I essentially do advisory for the public, nonprofit, and kind of international development space. And then what I like to do is find trends across all of these and run pilot projects, sometimes successful, sometimes horribly unsuccessful, to see what works and what doesn't work. So today I'd like to talk about a couple of things, but in light of all of the discussion over the last day and a half, there's two graphs I want to bring back as kind of primers in the discussion. The first one is related to the topic of education, which has come up a lot. And the reason I want to show this graph, it's a graph by Astro Teller, who was at Google, and he essentially transposed the rate of change in technology with humans' ability to adapt to that technology. And his argument here is that we have to learn faster and govern smarter when the rate of technology is faster than humans' ability to keep up with it. And the reason I bring this up is because I think that there's been a lot of conversation about the role of education, skills, and kind of a couple other terminologies, but really I think what we're talking about is how do we do things differently and what's the learning component of this. The reason I like this graph is that Deloitte Human Capital Trends report last year took this graph one step further, and they essentially said, yes, technology is going at a very fast curve, but individuals, businesses, and public policy are going at curves that are kind of aligned with that at different rates. And this answers the second question that has come up a lot over the last day and a half, which is when? When are these things, when is the future? Is it 24 hours from now or is it 24 years from now? And what this graph talks about is that individuals adapt much faster than businesses and public policy. So now going into the conversation around artificial intelligence and social good, oftentimes people say that public policy is where the social good context comes in. So for example, the technology for driverless cars exists, yes. Individuals, at what point will me, Anita, feel comfortable with sitting in a car that doesn't have a driver? TBD, it's going to take a hot second. At what point will businesses get to the point where they don't feel like it's cannibalizing their own business? That's going to take a little bit longer. And then public policy is the idea of, okay, are we going to have lanes that are different for driverless cars versus the cars that have drivers? Are there going to be different type of license plates? What's the ticketing process going to be looking like? And then going back to our question of truck drivers, essentially, what's the employment implications of this, right? So this concept of kind of thinking about this in a layered manner. What I'm going to be spending the majority of my time talking about today is going to be around artificial intelligence as it relates to recruiting. So as I'm recruiting specifically in the private sector. If many of you guys do not know, recruiting is extremely, extremely biased right now. There was a famous study that was conducted by Bertrand where essentially job applicants were sent out with white names and with African-American names, and they essentially saw a 50% increase in callbacks for those who had literally just the name of a white person versus the name of an African-American. And it's funny because a similar study has been done recently with similar results, right? So huge biases. You transpose that with the orchestra study. So the orchestra study was looking at the top 5 orchestras in the US in the late 1970s, where only 5% of them were women. At this point, they started instituting blind orchestra studies where essentially there would be a curtain. And what they saw is that essentially by 1997, they had 25% of the US orchestras had women. And today, sometimes you see up to 30%, right? Just by blinding the process. So you'll see kind of the two extremes. The interesting question that I thought of as I was thinking about this is I said, is there actually even value in interviews themselves? Are interviews giving us this special human element that we talk about that's so essential that AI and robots can't do? And my favorite research study is Jason Dana at the Yale School of Management. I not only like him because that's where I went, but I also like him because he said that interviews are absolutely useless. He did studies where he said he looked at GPA, class schedule, and an interview. One group looked at all 3 of those. The second group only looked at GPA and class study. And what he found was that those who actually went through an interview process had detrimental results. The quality of their candidates were actually worse. So now there's a lot behind this study. You should read it. It's really good. But I guess my question is, it's ineffective, it's taking a lot of time, and it's super biased. Why are we doing it? So in comes artificial intelligence. Lots of cool new AI technologies that exist for this. I'll be a pessimist in a second, but let me for a second get really excited about this, okay? HireVue is an organization. This is just a few. HireVue is an organization that looks at interviewing in the sense of data points on your face. So essentially, if you do a Skype interview, they look at up to 25,000 different data points on your face. Things like, my hands are moving like this. Are they moving too rigorously? Is my volume and is my speed at a consistent rate, which I know it is not. So you may not hire me, for example, but the artificial intelligence will kind of indicate that kind of correlation. Then there are things like Paradox. Paradox is run by this AI tool called Olivia. We can talk about in a separate panel why Olivia and Alexa are females and Genius and Watson are not, but that's a different panel for a different day. But essentially, Olivia makes my hiring experience much more positive than someone who hasn't responded to the resume that I submitted a long time ago. And just to give you a sense of the scale of these things, right? CVS Health is using Mia, 120,000 people in their retail locations. Nike is hiring 80,000 people in a year with these types of tools. Mia is great because it looks at efficiency of how long it takes to go from the hiring process to actually get them onboarded and into the system, okay? So these are all the positive things. It's super exciting technology, limiting a lot of the biases that exist. But, you know, there's always a but. I look back in history and I think about what are the challenges that could happen as it relates to some of these technologies. Has anyone heard of the Shirley card? Can you raise your hand just so I can not be repetitive for those who've heard it? Okay, so the Shirley card is one of my favorite examples in history. So the photo labs established in 1940s and 50s with Kodak used something called the Shirley card. And the Shirley card helped indicate whether colors were in their true state or not. They had found a young woman who worked in the photo labs. Her name was Shirley. Then every model that was used after was referred to as the Shirley card. And essentially, they would have this woman, in the entire time in the 40s to the 70s, it was a white woman who was wearing some sort of contrasting color, and they determined whether the colors matched or not. Half the people on this panel would not look good in a photograph taken by the Shirley card because it did not do a good job matching yellowish and brownish tones. The results of it actually came about ironically because it was the wood companies and the chocolate companies that said, hey, Kodak, you can't tell the difference between dark fine wood and light fine wood. You can't tell the difference between milk chocolate and light chocolate. And they said, oh, holy, you know, this is bad. And they realized that the photos and the cameras were extremely, extremely biased. And they were biased toward Shirley, or the concept of Shirley. 1970s, 1990s, they first started developing these lighter tones, and Oprah was the first one to pay a premium to use these types of technologies. The reason I refer to the Shirley card is because eventually, when HP had a big controversy in 2009 around facial recognition, where they could recognize a white face but not an African-American face, which I think was referenced a couple times in Absolutely last night, what they realized is that some of these things that were actually in a tool themselves, when transplanted to the digital world, still carried some of these biases. And that is extremely dangerous. But I've been told to talk about the future and not talk about the past. So this is the last slide where I talk about, well, what is it that we can do to go forward without going backward? And these are a couple of things that between research, the conversations that we've had over the last year and a half, day and a half, and just kind of some of my own thinking around this. The first one is inclusive creation of algorithms. As we know, algorithms are created in extremely, extremely homogeneous environments. There's been a big push to get more people to understand programming, to understand algorithms, and my thought process is you don't really need to understand it to be inclusively part of the process. You can do a lot of prototyping, you can do a lot of testing, but if at the end of the day, Facebook, that is used globally right now, was created by 2 or 3 white men in Silicon Valley, there's a major issue in how we are creating algorithms. The second is unbiased data sets. So when you think about things like Watson or anything or these artificial intelligence tools, everything that is predictive of the future is based on how things have worked in the past. So what happens is that they insert a ton of, not bad data, but biased data that eventually teaches the machine that, okay, in the past, we have only hired people from the Northeast, so if you're coming from Texas, I have a natural tendency to say no to you, which is totally arbitrary and doesn't make sense, and we ourselves as a company may not have made that decision, but the data set itself is biased to get the machine going. The third is regular pressure testing. I was sharing this with someone last night. Deodorants, shampoos, these aisles that we have are constantly changing their branding, constantly changing how the cap is made, what color it's used. Why is it that we do not pressure test the algorithms that we create after they go to market? The next one is action reasoning explanation. It was brought up in a panel yesterday morning. The idea here is that when a machine learning or an AI tool does something, please explain why it's doing that so we can understand whether that's a biased reaction or not. Is it that you're picking someone because they're in Oklahoma, or is it because they're underqualified because they don't have years of experience? Two very different kind of thought processes about why to reject someone. And then the last two is considering AI's legal case. So the reason I bring this up is because I was doing research in graduate school and took this class called Transnational Corporations and Human Rights. And the big issue here was around the responsibility and liability of the individual versus the responsibility and liability of the business. And at the end of the day, if something goes wrong in a coal mine, whose responsibility is it? And it was a big point of discussion. And I think this is going to be the big legal argument over the next decade, that if an artificial intelligence is being biased, whose responsibility is it? Is it the responsibility of the company? Is it the responsibility of a programmer because they were lazy or had unbiased programmed in? Or is it the responsibility of the consumer who should have known that they're going through an AI process? And finally, I'd like to end by encouraging all of us to use the principles of design thinking. And because the reason I say that is because the tools that we have, new tablets, phones, et cetera, were all created through the process of design thinking. So if we want to come up with a solution, I encourage us to think about using the solution of design thinking that puts a premium on prototyping and testing how things work out. And it was great. We were at lunch and we were all prototyping a similar type of problem, but we were doing it for different age groups, all with the assumption that if we try something and it fails, it's better than at least not trying anything at all. So,
Anita, thank you very much indeed. That brings us to Michelle.
Hi, everyone. I work for an organization called Strata Education Network, and we're a public charity with a corpus of about $1.4 billion to invest in education. And we do it in a multitude of ways. We do it through pure philanthropy, pure giving. We do it through owning of affiliate companies like nonprofit organizations like Inside Track, Road Trip Nation, College Confidential companies, and we just acquired the Council for Adult Experiential Learning, or otherwise known as CALE. These kinds of organizations that sort of situate around the student life cycle to get students in, through, and out of college. Our mission is all about completion with a purpose. And so we're very much focused on education to employment pathways. And one of the things that I'm doing at Strata is building an institute that's dedicated to the future of work. And the reason is that I want the learnings that we gain from doing more research in-house and gaining expertise, and also commissioning work from external experts to give us certain findings that we can then leverage into development. So I really want to create a sort of new kind of research and development lab. Because we are able to deploy capital in a multitude of ways, we have the opportunity to sort of start seeding some of these foundational elements of what I think needs to be the learning ecosystem of the future. So we've mentioned education sort of peripherally throughout the days, yesterday and today's discussion. But I think one of the things that that I'll kind of get to is the way in which, if we kind of just extrapolate from where we are today, we'll basically be doing Astro Teller's graph, where we will not be able to sort of meet the demands of the workforce of the future. So let me just start by kind of just agreeing a little bit with both what Alondra said yesterday and also with what Megan said today. I do feel like this is different in terms of the velocity and the rate of change. And I also do think we have this incredible opportunity to think about how we allocate the treasure to different sources of change. And I think that the reason why it's different is that I think there's kind of this long-standing notion that institutions of higher education in particular seem to be immune to this kind of change. But I actually think that the pressures from outside are going to mount to the point where there will be actual evolution in the way we deliver education and provide learning. And that pressure will most likely come from without. I've actually had experiences trying to develop this from within university settings, and it is difficult just because of the incredible amount of inertia. One of my favorite quotes is by the futurist Jim Dater at the University of Hawaii Manoa, who says that any useful statement about the future must first seem ridiculous. And so I'm going to say a lot of things that may seem ridiculous today, but I think it's a start to building and designing toward that future and beginning to prototype. So futurists on aging and longevity are actually predicting now that the first person, or the people who are actually going to live to be 150 years old, are living today. Some even estimate that that first person was born in 2015. And what I love about this statement is that as you think about that expansive amount of time of life, how long is that work life? Is that an 80-year work life? Is it a 100-year work life? It seems unfathomable. And in that context in particular, it seems even grossly unfathomable to think about how 2 years or 4 years or 6 years of learning on the front end of an 80-year work life will somehow last you that time period, right? And then you compound this with all the narratives that you hear about the future and automation and job obsolescence. You hear these stories about how 50% of the undergraduate degree, this is Deloitte, by 2020 will become obsolete. Or the top 10 jobs in LinkedIn in 2014 were jobs that never existed before. These are jobs like an iOS Android developer, a cloud manager, and social media intern, a big data architect. These things just didn't exist. So how do we make sense of this world? Jack Ma had this wonderful quote at the most recent World Economic Forum where he said, in relation to the third tech revolution, he said, whether you worry, it comes. And whether you don't worry, it comes. And so I've had a lot of experience in terms of helping institutions kind of think about disruptive innovations and change. And one of the fascinating things about change and newness in this context is that it's actually it's biologically tuned in us to perceive newness as danger. That the amygdala in our brain actually prevents us from sort of combating all of our biases toward negativity. And so we react to change and newness just in the same way as we would be reacting to a tiger in the bush. And that is why we kind of come up against sort of so much resistance. But I think it's important to start beginning to write these ridiculous futures. And I think we also have to understand that the future of our prosperity and our competitiveness in the world really depends upon a citizenry that constantly retools itself for this future. And I think in particular, I think it's really important to focus on working learners in particular. I think 17 to 22-year-olds are sort of well taken care of in many regards, especially by private foundations and other sorts of education reform movements. But as we think about this future of work, in which there will be so many more different kinds of skill sets demanded in the workforce, it's really difficult for us to think about how a working learner is going to kind of move seamlessly and frictionlessly within a system, in and out of learning and work. And just because if you think about today, higher education does a really poor job of facilitating on and off ramps to the process. We leave students who drop out with punishing debt, punishing student loan debt, and we don't make it easy for them to actually retool themselves and re-enter the system. And even if you think about today, some of the most innovative pathways like online education programs or online competency-based programs that are aligned to workforce needs, or these boot camps in web development or sales and medical device sales, these are really exciting, but none of them are nowhere near flexible enough for a working learner to kind of take that opportunity cost of going and pursuing that option. And most of them, to be honest, have no idea that these options exist. The potential that I see for all of these sort of exponential futures for education is that it can bring transparency to a needlessly opaque market. We do not do a good job of giving our students better information about their prospects by providing outcomes data. And I think we do a terrible job of sort of showing how learning and work are becoming inseparable. And that's why I think it's really important for us to seed these investments for the future. I think in this learning ecosystem of the future, it's important for us to think about this mythical stackable credential. I think people talk about sort of modularization of competencies and learning, but we actually have no ways of helping someone just get to the next level, help them articulate a goal a vision for their lives. I think the last day and a half has really helped me understand that part of this is a linguistic phenomenon. We are not good at putting language in the hands of learners to help them understand where they want to go. And some of them don't feel like they're empowered to make that vision for themselves for the future. So how do we create a way in which, we have an advisor, a trusted advisor, giving them sort of a GPS-like dynamic ability to sort of curate pathways for themselves for the future? How do we give them the skills to identify the kinds of competencies that they already have? How do we design prior learning assessments of the future so that we can actually understand where that learner is and the skills gaps that they might have to get them where they need to go? And I think, we need to think about all the existence of these kinds of boot camps, MOOCs, these things that are out there, and ways in which they can fit together for working learners. I think these days, when you think about education reformers and evangelists in education, there's a lot of lip service given to this notion of lifelong learning, that that we're going to have to sort of teach ourselves to learn how to learn for a lifetime. But the vast majority of resources do not go into actually seeding any of the innovations that will facilitate this kind of learning ecosystem in the future. A lot of it is going toward and is channeled towards institutions and learning providers as the gatekeepers between students and employers. And I think we really have to think about more direct movement in and out of learning and work. The problem with the investment thesis, an investment thesis is like this, is that we can't just extrapolate from where we are today to meet the needs and the emergent demands of that workforce. And I really think that we need to figure out what those flexible, on-demand, targeted solutions are for working learners to give them access to programs that will provide them more meaningful lives with also that deep sort of economic relevance. Thank you.